The air over St. Barrow village that Sunday morning in 1878 felt strangely heavy, as if the sky itself leaned down to press upon the cottages and narrow lanes. A thin mist curled over the cobblestones, moving low like it did not want to rise, shrouding boots and skirts in damp gray tendrils. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled, slow, uneven, and dull, the sound muffled as though the iron had been packed with cloth. It should have been a summons to joy, to gathering, to worship. Instead, it sounded like a warning. Men, women, and children filed toward the stone bulk of St. Barrow Church. Built in the early 1600s, its blackened spire leaned slightly to one side, giving it the unsettling look of a weary sentinel. The walls were slick with age and moss, its stained-glass windows veined with cracks that distorted the painted saints into disfigured figures. Yet the villagers came, clutching their Bibles, clutching one another, speaking in hushed voices. Word had spread all week that Father Alastair had called for a mass prayer of protection. No one seemed to know why. Inside the churchyard, the graves looked restless, their stones leaning forward like listeners craning to hear. Crows lined the crooked fence posts, their wings tucked tight, their eyes following the villagers as they shuffled toward the heavy oak doors. "Morning, Thomas," a farmer muttered to his neighbor, though his eyes never left the looming spire. "Aye," Thomas replied shortly, his hand squeezing the shoulder of his young daughter. "Best we not be late." When the doors groaned open, the villagers slipped into the nave, their shoes clattering softly against the uneven flagstones. The smell of damp wood, candle wax, and mildew clung to the air. Rows of pews stretched before them, worn smooth by generations of hands and knees. The organ pipes loomed in the shadows above the choir loft, but no music greeted them. Instead, silence pulsed in the rafters, broken only by the occasional cough or shuffling foot. It felt unnatural, that silence. Too thick, too intent. At the altar stood Father Alastair. A tall, gaunt man with a high forehead and sunken cheeks, he looked more frail than the villagers remembered. His cassock hung loosely from his frame, the fabric shifting whenever his hands trembled. He raised them now in blessing, but his voice caught when he spoke. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his words carrying oddly through the nave. Each syllable seemed to echo not once, but twice, as though the stone walls repeated them with a delay too deliberate to be chance. We gather in unity for a prayer that must be said." Murmurs rippled through the pews. Several women exchanged worried glances, their hands tightening around rosaries. Children squirmed. From the far back, old Mrs. Harlow whispered to her son. His voice, it shakes. "Hush," the son replied quickly. "He'll hear you." But Father Alastair already seemed to know. His pale eyes lifted toward the back pews, scanning the congregation with an intensity that made people avert their gaze. When his lips parted again, the tremble was worse, like each word was wrestled from his throat. "We shall pray together. A mass prayer for the sake of all." No one asked for the sake of what. They only bowed their heads because that was what one did in St. Barrow when the priest spoke. Yet an unease settled over them like ash. The bell tolled again outside, muffled, dragging, and the sound bled into the walls. Some of the children clapped their hands over their ears. The tone seemed lower than before, heavy enough to rattle the candle holders. A wax drip slid down and hissed faintly as it touched the stone. Then the choir filed in, 10 boys and girls in white robes, their faces pale as bone. They moved without chatter, without even a smile, their eyes fixed ahead. When they took their places, they stood too still, like statues awaiting command. Father Alastair raised his hands once more. "The hymn," he rasped. And the choir began. At first, their voices blended sweetly, the familiar hymn echoing through the church. But quickly something shifted. The harmony bent out of shape. One child sang too slow, another too fast, and the words overlapped in ways that jarred the ear. Then it was as if another voice had joined them, a low droning that none of the villagers could see the source of. It wasn't human. It wasn't even earthly. It was a vibration that seeped into the bones of everyone present. People stirred nervously in their seats. A baby wailed and was swiftly hushed. The hymn continued, but the words no longer made sense. Even the children in the choir seemed confused, their lips moving in patterns that didn't match the melody. Still, they sang on, compelled by something unseen. Father Alastair's trembling grew worse. His hands shook so violently that the chalice on the altar rattled. His eyes darted upward toward the great crucifix hanging over the altar, and for a fleeting second, his face betrayed not faith but fear. "Remain," he whispered hoarsely, though the congregation wasn't moving. "Remain in your seats, no matter what." The villagers stiffened. Why would he say that unless he feared they might run? The hymn faltered. One of the choir boys suddenly stopped singing and clutched his throat, his mouth gaping like a fish pulled from water. His wide eyes bulged as he tried to force out sound, but nothing came. Only silence poured from his mouth, a silence so sharp it seemed louder than any scream. The others stumbled in their song, their voices quivering, then resumed as though compelled by a force stronger than their terror. Gasps rippled through the church. Parents half rose from their pews, but Father Alistair's voice cracked like a whip. Sit. The command, though spoken through trembling lips, held such unnatural force that everyone obeyed instantly. Mothers dragged their children back down, men stiffened, eyes locked on the altar. Outside the bell tolled again. This time no one had pulled the rope. The sound reverberated through the nave, making the stained glass windows shiver in their frames. Red and blue light fractured across the pews, painting faces in grotesque shades. Father Alistair spread his arms. The Mass prayer begins, he intoned. But his voice broke again, echoing strangely as if another voice, darker, deeper, spoke the words with him. The villagers bowed their heads. Some prayed with lips moving rapidly, others clenched their hands until knuckles whitened. But a few raised their eyes, and those few noticed the same thing at once. The crucifix above the altar seemed to be tilting. Not the wooden beams, but the figure nailed to it, the Christ carved centuries ago, its head lowering slowly, unnaturally, as though regarding them. A collective shudder passed through the pews. And then silence. The choir's voices ceased all at once. The baby's cries vanished. The bell outside cut off mid-swing. Even the wind against the windows stopped. It was not mere absence of sound. It was a silence that pressed in from every side, crushing, suffocating. A silence that swallowed the beat of the heart, the hiss of breath, the very thoughts that struggled in the mind. The congregation sat frozen, eyes wide, hands gripping the pews until splinters pierced flesh. Yet none cried out. None could. Father Alistair's mouth moved, but no sound escaped. His lips formed words the villagers couldn't hear, words they weren't sure they wanted to hear. His eyes glistened with tears, his face a mask of pleading, not with them but with something unseen. In that silence, every villager understood without words. Whatever prayer this was, it was not for salvation. It was for survival. And not all of them would survive. The silence held for only a moment, though it felt like an eternity. Then, like a slow tide retreating from the shore, the faintest sound returned. The shuffle of feet, the uneasy rustle of skirts, the sharp intake of breath as if lungs remembered they must breathe. Yet the silence had not left. It lingered like smoke woven into every shadow of St. Barrow Church. Father Alistair remained at the altar, his chest heaving, his face drained of all color. His lips moved in a hurried prayer, though no one could hear it. At last, sound cracked through the air again. A cough from one of the men in the pews, a whimper from a frightened child, the uneasy creak of wood as people shifted in their seats. The priest lifted one trembling hand. "Stay," he rasped. Do not rise. You must hear me first." His voice was weak, almost strangled, as though he spoke through a cloth pressed tight to his mouth. Some of his words reached them, others dissolved mid-air. It was as if the silence had chosen which parts of his speech it would allow, plucking syllables away before they could reach the congregation. Mass, silence, not ordinary. You must, silence, remain faithful. The villagers leaned forward, straining to catch each fractured word. The weight of not understanding pressed on them more than the weight of the words themselves. "What is he saying?" whispered one man to his wife. I can't hear it all," she murmured back. Father Alistair's hand struck the altar, rattling the chalice. His hollow eyes blazed with desperation. Listen. The word echoed unnaturally as though repeated by voices not his own. There is something bound here. Beneath stone. Beneath us. Gasps stirred through the pews. Several crossed themselves. The choir boys shifted uneasily in their robes. The priest's voice faltered again. It wakes when we, silence, together. The prayer, it is not, silence, for God. Those fragments hung in the air like shards of glass, cutting through the hearts of all who heard them. Not for God? Then for whom? A woman rose halfway to her feet, clutching her shawl tight around her shoulders. "Father, what is this?" she cried. "Why call us here if it is not for the Lord's blessing?" Her words cracked the air like lightning, but before Father Alistair could reply, the silence surged back, swallowing the sound of his answer. His lips moved furiously, but nothing emerged. His eyes widened in anguish. He tried again, louder, and only fragments slipped through like water leaking through cupped hands. Protect us. Silence. Cannot resist. Silence. Once begun. The woman sank back into her seat, trembling, clutching her rosary so tightly that the beads dug into her skin. Children whimpered. Men glanced at one another, their jaws tight, their eyes flicking to the heavy doors of the church. Yet none dared to rise. The priest's warning clung to them, binding them to their pews with invisible chains. Father Alistair closed his eyes, pressing his palms together until his knuckles whitened. When he spoke again, his voice was barely more than a whisper, yet every villager heard it as if whispered directly into their ears. Do not leave. If you leave, it follows. A murmur of panic stirred in the congregation. One of the younger men muttered, Follows? What follows? But no one answered. The priest's eyes snapped open. The silence, he croaked. The word itself seemed to deepen the air around them, as if naming it had fed its strength. The lamps along the walls sputtered, their flames bending inward as though drawn toward a hollow. Father Alistair staggered a step back from the altar, clutching the edge for balance. I tried, he whispered, to keep it sealed. The foundation stones, the old vow. His voice broke off. His mouth kept moving, but the silence had swallowed everything. And then, in the stillness, the congregation heard something they had not expected. A second voice. Not spoken aloud, but threading through their minds. It was not Father Alistair's nor any human voice. It was cold, resonant, without breath or tongue. Pray, it urged. Pray as one. Several villagers clutched their heads, groaning. One of the choir boys collapsed to his knees, pressing his hands over his ears though the voice was not heard with ears. Father Alistair slammed his fist on the altar. No, he cried. This time the word thundered through the church, carrying with it a force that cracked the plaster near the rafters. You will not. The villagers flinched as one. His chest heaved. His lips trembled with words he could no longer voice. At last he spread his hands helplessly, his voice reduced to a broken rasp. You must understand. Once begun it cannot stop. The prayer, silence, is not ours. The congregation sat in terrified stillness. A farmer in the third pew crossed himself again and again, whispering the Lord's Prayer under his breath. A mother gathered her child onto her lap, rocking him though her own body shook. At the back, Thomas Harlow leaned forward, his jaw set. Father, he called out, if this is not the Lord's Prayer, then what demon's work have you brought us into? The silence rushed in to devour the question. Thomas's lips moved, but no sound emerged. He recoiled in horror, clutching his throat, his eyes wild. He tried again, but silence consumed him. He could not speak. His wife grasped his arm, sobbing. Father Alistair's head bowed. His shoulders sagged as though centuries of weight bore down on them. I begged them not to come, he murmured, though only a few near the front could hear. His voice wavered, slipping in and out of silence. The bishop, he would not believe. He said a mass prayer would strengthen us. His eyes lifted again, wet with tears. But prayer strengthens it. Every voice, every word, it feeds on them. It grows. A wave of horror swept through the congregation. Mothers clutched children tighter. Men clenched fists helplessly. No one moved toward the doors now. Fear had sealed them to their pews. Father Alistair's hands trembled as he lifted the Bible from the altar. But when he opened it, the pages were blank. Not a letter, not a verse remained. Only pale, empty parchment stared back at him. The priest gasped, clutching the book to his chest as though to hide it from the others. But too many had already seen. A strangled cry rose from the pews. God help us, someone whispered. Father Alistair shook his head slowly. Not God, he said, his voice strangely clear though hoarse. Not anymore. And with that, the silence rushed back, so absolute, so crushing, that the very timbers of St. Barrow groaned in protest. Candles guttered out. The congregation sat in darkness, hearing nothing but the furious beat of their own hearts, hearts that no longer belonged entirely to them. The silence did not last. It never did. Like a tide creeping back across sand, sound returned to St. Barrow Church in a slow and uneven trickle. First came the rustle of skirts, then the muffled cough of a man near the back pew, then the faint squeak of a wooden bench shifting under weight. The congregation clung to these sounds as if they were proof that the world had not been swallowed whole. Father Alistair stood rigid at the altar, sweat beading across his pale brow. His hands trembled so violently that the Bible nearly slipped from his grip. He did not open it again, the blank pages had robbed him of that illusion. Instead, he fixed his gaze on the choir assembled before him. 10 children in white robes, their faces pallid in the flickering candlelight, their hands clasped before them. He swallowed hard. His voice came thin, shaking. "The hymn," he said. "Begin." A ripple of unease swept through the pews. Several mothers stiffened, clutching their children tighter. Men furrowed their brows, as if they sensed the priest's command was not entirely his own. Still the choir obeyed. At first their voices rose sweetly, familiar notes spilling into the nave. It was a hymn sung for generations in St. Barrow, one that spoke of light breaking the darkness, of mercy enduring forever. The words carried faint comfort, and some villagers dared to exhale, their lips moving in prayer alongside the children. But then something shifted. The harmony bent. One boy's voice trailed a beat too slow. A girl's pitch climbed too high, wavering on the edge of shrillness. Another voice came in early, overlapping at an odd angle. The melody fractured like a mirror struck by a hammer. The villagers glanced at one another nervously. It was still the hymn, but wrong, like hearing one's own name whispered in a stranger's voice. The children seemed to sense it too. Their eyes widened, their brows knit in confusion, yet their mouths kept moving, driven by a force they could not resist. They sang faster, slower, louder, softer, all at once. Their voices no longer blended, they collided. And then came the other sound. Low at first, like a hum vibrating beneath the floor. It was not produced by any of the children. It had no source, no breath, no body. Yet it filled the air, growing louder, richer, resonant. The hymn bent around it, warped to accommodate it, as though the invisible presence was conducting them. The villagers stiffened. Several clamped their hands over their ears, but it did little good. The hum was not heard with ears, it burrowed into the skull, settled behind the eyes, pressed into the very marrow of the bones. The choir's rhythm broke completely. Their words fell out of step, overlapping in impossible patterns. One child sang the opening verse while another screamed the final refrain, though both were meant to be silent at that moment. It was as if time itself had fractured. Father Alistair gripped the altar so hard his knuckles turned white. His lips moved silently, desperate prayer spilling forth, but the silence had taken his words again. His eyes brimmed with tears as he looked upon the children, their small faces contorted in strain and terror. Then with a shudder one of the boys faltered. His voice cut off abruptly, replaced by a sharp, keening silence that stabbed the ears. His mouth still moved, his throat strained, but no sound came. He clutched at his chest, gasping noiselessly. A woman screamed from the pews, rushing to rise, but her husband grabbed her arm. "Don't," he hissed. His own voice shook. "Didn't you hear him? Stay seated." The boy collapsed to his knees, eyes bulging, mouth opening and closing in a silent wail. The others sang on, their own tones twisting further, as though his silence had been absorbed into their hymn. Another girl stumbled, her voice splitting into 2 distinct notes, one high and one impossibly low. She clutched at her throat, eyes brimming with terror. Her body convulsed, yet her lips kept forming the hymn's words, dragged on by a force far greater than her will. The congregation erupted in murmurs, some sobbing, others muttering frantic prayers. A man near the back shouted, "Stop them! For God's sake, stop!" But the words fell into silence, devoured before they could echo. His lips kept moving, his throat strained, but no sound emerged. His wife shrieked and clung to him, yet even her cries vanished into the pressing void. The priest staggered forward, his cassock dragging across the stone steps. He reached for the choir as if to stop them, but his feet froze mid-stride. His body trembled violently as though invisible hands held him in place. His eyes rolled upward, his jaw clenched. When at last his voice tore free, it was not entirely his own. "Do not intervene," he choked. "It requires their song." The villagers recoiled. Mothers shielded children with their arms. Men stared in disbelief, their knuckles white against the pews. No one dared move. The hymn twisted further, now unrecognizable. The words no longer belonged to any human tongue. The notes spiraled downward, colliding with the low hum until the entire church vibrated like a struck bell. Dust sifted down from the rafters. The stained glass windows rattled in their frames. The children's faces contorted in pain. Tears streamed down their cheeks. Yet their mouths opened wider, jaws unhinging beyond natural limits. Their voices rose, cracked, bled into the air. One by one their eyes rolled back, showing only whites. And then all at once they stopped. Silence fell so sudden it made the congregation flinch. The absence of sound roared louder than the hymn itself. The choir stood frozen, their robes still swaying faintly as though the echoes of their song clung to the fabric. Then one boy toppled forward, collapsing against the altar steps. His body hit the stone with a sickening thud. His lips moved soundlessly, still forming the hymn's words. Another girl fell back against the pews, her limbs jerking as though pulled by invisible strings. Her parents screamed silently, clawing at the air, unable to reach her. The others followed, crumpling one by one, their mouths still moving though no sound emerged. 10 children, writhing, gasping, eyes rolled white, lips mouthing words no human ear could hear. Father Alistair dropped to his knees, his hands raised to the heavens. His voice broke through for a fleeting instant. "Lord, forgive me." And then even that was gone. The silence swelled, filling the nave, the rafters, the very marrow of every soul present. The villagers felt it pressing into their heads, into their hearts, into their prayers. Their own thoughts no longer sounded like their own. For in that silence, another voice whispered, "Continue." And every villager knew, this hymn was not finished. Not yet. The hymn had ended not with the steady cadence of harmony but with fractured voices collapsing into silence, like glass shattering across the stone floor. For a moment no one moved. The church, swollen with villagers packed shoulder to shoulder, seemed to hold its breath. The only sound was the brittle scraping of a chair leg against the flagstones as an elderly farmer shifted uncomfortably. Father Alistair stood at the altar, his hands gripping the wooden lectern so tightly that his knuckles blanched. His lips parted as if he wished to speak, to smooth the jagged air that clung to the congregation like smoke. But the words caught. His throat worked, yet nothing came. Only the dull toll of silence. It was then, without warning, that the candles guttered. Dozens of flames, burning dutifully since the first bell had rung, flickered as though in unison. The congregation noticed it at once. Dozens of heads turned, dozens of eyes followed the trembling flames. The air did not stir, yet the fire bowed low, stretching, gasping. Then, as though some unseen mouth had drawn them all in, they extinguished at the exact same moment. A thunderclap of blackness descended. The great vaulted ceiling vanished. The frescoes of saints dissolved. Even the familiar wooden pews, worn smooth by generations of parishioners, disappeared into an ocean of shadow. The church became a hollow void where sight had no anchor. And with the darkness came silence. It was not the ordinary hush of reverence, nor the patient stillness of listening ears. This silence was absolute, an oppressive weight that smothered even the smallest sound. Someone in the pews gasped, a sharp, fearful intake of breath, but the sound was strangled midway, devoured before it could travel. Another villager tried to call for his wife, but his lips moved in the void with no answer. No echo, no murmur. It was as if the silence had grown teeth. Father Alistair staggered back from the altar. He could not see the faces of his parishioners, but he felt their fear vibrating like a current through the dark. He raised his hand instinctively to make the sign of the cross, but the gesture felt empty, swallowed by an unseen presence. A child whimpered somewhere near the front. The sound was thin, fragile, but even that small cry faltered, crumpled, as though some invisible pressure pressed down upon the child's chest. The mother clutched the boy to her, rocking him, her lips forming prayers that refused to find breath. The silence deepened. It was not stillness, it was hunger. Then, faintly, a single sound surfaced. At first it was so low it could have been mistaken for the creak of the old timbers or the shifting of boots against stone. But no, the sound was deliberate. A low, resonant hum, like the rumble of a distant organ pipe. It vibrated beneath the skin, an alien note that did not belong to the hymn books nor to the voice of any man or woman. It was rising from the altar itself. Father Alistair froze, his hand hovering midair. The hum crawled up his bones, into his chest, lodging deep within his sternum until his heart thudded out of rhythm. He staggered and gripped the edge of the lectern again, his eyes wide though the darkness allowed him to see nothing. The congregation felt it too. The villagers shifted restlessly, their breathing quick and shallow. Some tried to stand, only to stumble in the blindness, their knees colliding with the pews. A few cried out, but their voices carried no sound, their mouths open to a void that swallowed every syllable. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the hum stopped. The silence returned, denser, colder. The parishioners dared not move now. A few clutched one another in the dark, their fingernails digging into flesh, needing to feel human warmth. Others fell to their knees instinctively, though no words escaped their lips. Father Alistair swallowed against the dryness in his throat. He forced himself to speak, to command the silence with God's word. He opened his mouth, shaping the familiar Latin, In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. But no sound followed. His tongue struck the air uselessly. His faith, his training, all his years in the church, stripped away by something unseen. The air grew colder. Breath frosted against invisible walls. And then came the footsteps. Soft, deliberate, slow. They did not belong to any of the villagers. Everyone had frozen in place, every instinct screaming against motion. These steps moved down the central aisle between the pews, echoing not in sound but in the shiver of wood and stone beneath. One by one, the villagers turned toward where they thought the footsteps came from. The darkness was complete, no eyes could pierce it. Yet they knew, something was walking among them. The steps halted. No one dared breathe. And then, so quietly it almost slipped past unnoticed, a single candle reignited at the far corner of the altar. Its flame was weak, trembling, barely holding against the void. But its light revealed enough. On the altar rail, where Father Alastair had set the gospel book, a mark had appeared. Black as ink, charred into the wood, it curled like a brand. Not a cross. Not a symbol of faith. It was a circle broken in two jagged lines like a wound carved into the very grain. Father Alastair's heart plummeted. He had seen the shape before, in forbidden texts, whispered warnings passed from older priests. A sigil that did not belong to God, nor any saint. The villagers, now catching sight of it in the flickering glow, erupted in panic. Mothers clutched their children, men surged to their feet, chairs toppled against the flagstones. But their panic remained mute. No screams, no cries, no desperate prayers, just the soundless thrashing of bodies trying to flee through the dark. The single candle sputtered and died. And the silence consumed them all again. They said the church fell silent. That was the only detail every villager agreed upon when the sun finally rose over St. Barrow the following morning. The bells had stopped ringing, the candles had never returned, and the hymn had dissolved into a silence so complete it swallowed even the beating of their own hearts. And yet, when asked to recall what came after, no two survivors told the same story. Some claimed they awoke sprawled across the pews as though they had fainted. Others insisted they had fled into the night, their hands clawing at the church doors until daylight spilled through the cracks. A few swore they had never left the church at all, but rather found themselves standing in the churchyard graves, dirt pressed beneath their fingernails, the silence trailing them like a shadow. No blood was found. No corpses. Only the congregation, shaken and pale, with blank spaces where their memories should have been. Father Alastair was the worst of them. When the bishop's men questioned him, they found him hunched in his rectory, his hair disheveled, his eyes rimmed red from lack of sleep. The gospel book still sat open on his desk, but his gaze wandered past it, fixed on some invisible point in the far corner. His lips moved constantly, but the words refused to shape into sentences. Only fragments slipped out. Not my voice, not mine, never mine. He could not describe the sigil. He could not explain why the altar rail bore marks that smelled faintly of sulfur and charred wood. When pressed, he shook violently and clutched his rosary until his knuckles bruised. The villagers fared little better. Old Mrs. Harrow, who had tended the church garden for 40 years, swore she remembered nothing except the silence. Yet when she spoke, her sentences bent oddly, as though she were quoting someone unseen. "It told us to listen," she muttered to her daughter in the days after, her eyes glassy. "Listen, but it wasn't my thought. Do you understand? It wasn't mine." Her daughter wept, for the old woman had repeated those same words every hour since the blackout, as if caught in a loop. Another survivor, young Elias Cross, a shepherd's apprentice, became known in the village for waking screaming at night. He would cry out words no one else understood, sharp syllables that clawed at the ears like broken glass. When his father asked what tormented him, Elias only shook his head violently. Finally, on one sleepless dawn, the boy whispered, "It was me speaking. But it wasn't my voice. It was inside pressing out. As if my tongue belonged to something else." He refused to return to the church grounds after that. A sense of unease grew across St. Barrow like a sickness. The villagers no longer spoke of the Massachusetts. They called it only the silence. Crops withered despite the summer rains. Children refused to play near the churchyard. Even the birds seemed to avoid its steeple, their flight paths bending unnaturally wide as though skirting an invisible boundary. What unsettled the bishop's men most was how little physical evidence remained. No candle wax dripped on the stones, no broken pews, no signs of struggle. It was as though nothing had transpired at all, save for the hollowed expressions of those who had gathered there. And yet, faint echoes lingered in the minds of the witnesses. One farmer described how he had tried to scream for his wife when the lights went out, only to feel the silence swallow him whole. "It didn't just stop my voice," he said, his hands trembling as he wrung his cap. "It listened to it, pulled it in. Like something wanted to wear my sound for itself." Another villager swore he heard his own mother's lullaby filling the dark, though she had died years before. "It was her," he whispered, rocking back and forth. "I know her song anywhere. But she wasn't there. She couldn't have been there. It was in my skull, rattling like chains. Her words in my mouth." The testimonies conflicted, contradicted, overlapped in unsettling ways. But one detail pierced through again and again. Every survivor remembered a voice that did not belong to them. Not a voice they heard with their ears. A voice that rang inside their heads, some soft and coaxing, others harsh and booming. Some described it as their own voice, repeating prayers or curses against their will. Others claimed it took the form of their loved ones, whispering things they never wished to hear. But each swore it was not theirs to begin with. The bishop's men, unnerved, collected these reports with caution. Yet as they recorded the testimonies, they noticed something stranger still. The witnesses spoke in rhythms that mirrored one another. Pauses fell in the same places, phrases twisted in identical ways, as though the villagers were not speaking from memory but from a script none of them remembered reading. It was less like recollection and more like possession. In the weeks that followed, St. Barrow grew quieter. Not from reverence, not from mourning, but from fear of words themselves. The villagers no longer sang as they worked the fields. They muttered little at market, refusing to gossip as they once did. Children were hushed swiftly by anxious mothers if they laughed too loudly. Silence had become contagious. Father Alistair retreated further into isolation. He stopped ringing the bells. He stopped leading prayers aloud. Instead, he wrote compulsively, page after page of frantic scrawl in Latin and English, much of it incoherent. What little could be read described witnesses of nothing, voices without breath, and a memory that devours. When asked what he meant, he only said, "They saw nothing. They heard nothing." But nothing heard them. The bishop's men eventually abandoned the inquiry. Too many contradictions. Too little proof. The church was sealed, the doors barred. But in the minds of the villagers, the mass never ended. It lingered. Each time silence fell too thickly in a room, they glanced at one another with wide, fearful eyes, as if listening for something hidden in its folds. And sometimes, though they dared not admit it, when they lay awake at night, staring at the darkened rafters of their cottages, they swore they heard it again. A whisper not their own, curling beneath thought, patient and precise. "Witnesses of nothing," it said. "And yet I am with you still." The dawn after the silence rose pale and brittle, its light sluggish as it crept across St. Barrow. A thin fog clung to the churchyard, shrouding the crooked gravestones until they looked like bent silhouettes of the congregation that had once gathered inside. A small crowd formed beyond the locked gates, whispering with the hushed urgency of those who dare not speak too loudly of the night before. The bishop's men had barred the doors, but villagers demanded answers. Husbands searched for wives who had not returned home. Mothers scanned the faces of those gathered, hoping to glimpse their missing children. The count once done was grim. 30 souls who had entered the church for the Mass had not been seen since. Father Alistair did not appear to meet them. He remained in his rectory, curtains drawn, a single candle burning though it was broad daylight. The bishop's men, reluctant yet bound by duty, unlatched the great oak doors of St. Barrow Church as the villagers pressed forward to see what secrets the holy house still kept. The hinges groaned in protest as the doors swung wide. The air inside was stagnant, untouched by morning breeze. It smelled faintly of tallow, damp stone, and something metallic that curdled the stomach. The great nave was dim, its windows clouded with fog, but no bodies lay sprawled across the floor as so many had feared. The pews, however, told another story. Each wooden bench bore marks, grooves carved not by tools but by desperate flesh. Deep impressions of fingers, some long and slender, others small and childlike, sank into the grain as though the wood had softened under desperate grip. The pews were scarred with the evidence of a congregation clinging to them in absolute terror. One pew at the center held the clearest impression. 10 fingers pressed so deeply the wood had splintered. Alongside them ran faint trails of dried blood, the marks of nails torn raw as their owners clawed uselessly against the silence. The villagers recoiled, some crossing themselves, others weeping openly. The bishop's men moved cautiously down the aisles, tracing the lines with gloved hands, their faces pale. "There should be bodies," one of them muttered. "There should be something." But there was nothing. No bodies. No clothing. No discarded shoes or shawls. No rosaries dropped in haste. Not even the faintest sign of struggle beyond the imprints in the wood. 30 villagers had simply vanished. The altar remained bare, the gospel book closed, though its leather cover bore faint burns along the edges, as if a candle had leaned too close but left no soot. The sigil Father Alastair had seen was gone, scrubbed away or erased by some unseen hand. The silence hung heavy still, as though reluctant to release its grip. One of the bishop's men, a younger cleric named Brother Matthew, bent low to inspect the grooves in the pews. He pressed his hand into one of them experimentally, his fingers fitting neatly into the impression left behind. His eyes widened. "It's warm," he whispered. The others stiffened. The morning air inside the church was cold enough that their breaths misted, yet the wood, where the mark sank deepest, seemed to thrum faintly with a lingering heat, as if the hands that had clutched them had only just released. Brother Matthew jerked his hand back, crossing himself in hurried panic. "This place is not empty," he said through gritted teeth. The villagers, already trembling, began to murmur prayers under their breath. Yet even those prayers sounded fragile, hollow, as if the church swallowed them before they could take shape. The investigation continued, though no new discoveries came. No footprints in the dust. No torn hymnals. No trace of where 30 souls had gone. Only the pews, their scars deep and raw, and the silence that seemed to thicken with each passing moment inside. Finally, the bishop's men ordered the church closed again. They herded the villagers back into the yard, their faces grave, their voices low. "We will return with more men," they promised, though the promise rang empty. That night, however, the missing did not return. Families lit lanterns in their windows, waiting for a knock that never came. Dogs howled at the edges of the village. Some swore they saw figures lingering in the fog near the churchyard, motionless silhouettes that dissolved if stared at too long. Others claimed to hear faint scratching against their doors, fingers dragging across wood in the same desperate way the pews bore. Father Alastair was seen pacing by his rectory window until dawn, his shadow restless against the curtain. When asked why he had not entered the church himself, he only murmured, "They are not gone. They are only elsewhere. The pews remember because the wood listens. God help us, even the wood listens now." No one pressed him further. By the week's end, fear had calcified into a terrible truth. The 30 were never coming back. And St. Barrow Church, once the heart of the village, became a hollow shell haunted not by the dead, but by the evidence of their final moments. The villagers stopped calling it the silence. They now whispered another name for it, spoken with dread whenever the fog thickened or the bells refused to ring. They called it the empty pews. The church doors had been locked for days, its silence settling like dust over the village. No bell tolled. No hymn rose. And no villager dared step too close to the heavy oak doors where the missing 30 had last been seen. But one night, while the village lay under a pale, watchful moon, a boy named Elias Cross crept into the rectory. His father had begged him not to. "Leave the priest be, son, leave him be," but Elias could not. Ever since the blackout, he had dreamed of voices that spoke through his own tongue, and each time he woke he saw the candle burning in Father Alastair's window. Something he believed lingered with the priest. Inside the rectory the air was thick with smoke and ink. Papers littered the floor, scrawled with erratic handwriting, Latin phrases breaking mid-word. Father Alastair was not there. The chair still rocked faintly as though he had only just stood. On the desk, beneath the gospel book, Elias found a leather-bound journal. The priest's diary. Its cover was scarred, edges darkened as though held too close to flame. Elias hesitated before opening it, his hands trembling. When he did, the ink inside seemed almost to shift against the page, words blurring before settling into legibility. The first entries were ordinary enough. Dates, sermon notes, confessions heard. But as Elias turned the pages, the script grew more frantic, the lines darker, blotched by a trembling hand. And soon, the words revealed the secret Father Alastair had carried alone. Diary of Father Alastair, October 3, 1877. They told me nothing when I arrived at St. Barrow. Only that the parish had stood since 1620, and that the foundation stones were older still. Yet the villagers speak of vows made before the first bell ever rang. They do not speak them openly, but I see it in their eyes when the fog presses too near the windows. October 19th. I have discovered records in the vestry trunk, charters written not by bishops but by masons. They speak of a vow, an oath sealed beneath the earth before the church was consecrated. I cannot decipher all the Latin, but one phrase repeats, Silentium aeternum, eternal silence. November 2nd. The stones beneath the altar are not like the rest. They are darker, smoother, as though worn by hands that trembled as they laid them. A seal is carved there, a circle broken in two. The masons swore the church would never fall, provided the vow was never broken. But what was sworn, and to whom? December 12. Last night I dreamed the church spoke. Not with voice but with silence. In it I heard promises not mine. When I awoke, I found my rosary tangled in my throat as though I had tried to swallow it whole. Elias's hands grew damp against the parchment. He turned another page. January 9, 1878. I have tried to ask the villagers. They refused to answer. Old Harrow spit upon the ground and told me, "We are only tenants here. The vow was sworn long before our blood. If the vow was broken, he would not say what would come. Only that we must never let the silence deepen. Never let it listen back." February 3. I found a second seal in the crypt beneath the church. The circle again carved deep into the stone, filled with wax that has not melted despite the years. Someone prayed there once, not to God, but to something that demanded hush. I knelt to pray myself, and the silence answered before I spoke. March 15. It grows harder to preach. My words falter. My tongue feels not my own. The vow presses on me like a weight. It was not meant to be remembered, yet it remembers us. What did they bury beneath the altar? What demands this endless hush? The handwriting from here devolved into scrawls. Elias could barely piece together the fragments, though certain phrases repeated, jagged and underlined until the page nearly tore. The vow lives in the stones. The silence is not absence but presence. We are only its witnesses. The final entry, dated only days before the Mass, was written in a different hand, shakier but deliberate, as though Alistair had forced himself through terror to write each letter. April 10, 1878. Tomorrow they gather. Tomorrow the vow will take what is owed. I hear it in the walls, in the rafters, in the hollow of my chest. 30 voices promised, 30 lives sealed. They were never parishioners, they were the tithe. I tried to warn them. But how can one speak when the silence eats the words? I am complicit. I am its vessel. May God forgive me, for God cannot hear me here. Elias dropped the book. His breath rattled in his chest, though the room was quiet as a grave. He stumbled back, knocking the chair aside. The diary lay open on the desk, its final line staring back like a wound across the page. The vow was ancient, older than St. Barrow, older than the stones. It waits beneath. It will always wait beneath. When Elias tried to cry out, his voice caught. The words snagged in his throat, swallowed before they left his lips. For a moment, the silence pressed against his skull, heavy and knowing. Then, faintly, as though whispered through the pages of the diary itself, he heard it. You have read. Now you are bound. The silence did not stay within the stone walls of St. Barrow. It followed. At first, the survivors thought it was merely exhaustion, an echo of the horror they had endured within the church. They returned home shaken, their minds muddled, their lips parched as if words themselves resisted being spoken. But soon they realized it wasn't only inside them. It had bled outward into their cottages, their streets, their fields. Dogs stopped barking. Horses refused to neigh, stamping nervously but without sound. Chickens pecked the dirt, their beaks clicking shut but producing no noise. Even the ravens, which had always nested in the steeple, circled above in mute flocks, wings beating air that carried no sound. The villagers would gather in their homes, trying to console each other, trying to pray aloud, but every syllable felt swallowed before it reached the air. Voices emerged cracked, hollow, fading faster than breath itself. Mothers called to children, and though the words left their lips, the children tilted their heads in confusion, as if sound had never been born at all. It was as if silence had not only invaded their lives, but had claimed their world. The hollow heart. In the cottage of Martha Wilkes, a widow who had been among the survivors, the hearth fire burned one evening with a strange muteness. The wood cracked and shifted, yet no pop, no hiss, no crumble was heard. She sat with her son Elias, a boy of 9 whose laughter had once filled the house. That night, Elias traced his fingers in the ash at the fireplace's edge, drawing spirals. "Mama," he mouthed, though his lips formed the word without sound. She leaned forward, frightened. "What is it?" she whispered, though even her whisper fell dead before it left her mouth. The boy's hand shook as he pointed at the spirals, then drew another. His eyes widened with tears, and Martha realized he was trying to copy something he had seen, not imagined. When she asked what it meant, Elias only looked at her with empty terror. The dead streets. By the third night, the streets of Barrow Hollow were unrecognizable. People moved cautiously as though afraid the silence itself could strike them down. Shops remained shut, Doors were barred. Even the town bell, which had tolled every dawn for decades, hung frozen. Those who had not been in the church began whispering among themselves. They claimed the survivors had brought something back, something that did not belong to the world of the living. Suspicion grew, neighbors eyeing neighbors, the air thick with fear. But even suspicion had no voice. The silence was a predator, and it starved them of expression. The cracks in the mind. Inside many homes, the silence turned inward. Thomas Reed, a miller, was found sitting at his table long past midnight, scratching at his ears until they bled. His wife begged him to stop, but her pleas were as useless as air. When neighbors discovered him the next day, his nails had broken from clawing his own head. His last message, scrawled shakily into the table with a knife, read, "It is not silence. It is listening." Another survivor, Agnes Hart, began to refuse food altogether. She claimed she could hear words in her thoughts, but they were not hers. They told her to be still, to surrender, to accept the vow. Her family thought she had lost her senses, until one dawn she was gone, her bed cold, the sheets empty. Only her rosary beads remained, arranged into a spiral on the pillow. Father Alistair's absence. Some villagers sought Father Alistair again, hoping he might explain what was happening. But the rectory was locked, his shutters sealed. The priest did not answer. A boy named Samuel, who was brave enough to climb to the rectory window, claimed he had seen the priest kneeling on the floor, hands covering his ears, lips moving soundlessly in frantic prayer. When the boy tried again the next evening, the rectory was dark. Father Alistair was gone. What he had written in his diary now haunted those who had read it, the ancient vow, sealed beneath the foundation. They whispered that the silence was not a curse but a call, that something was waiting beneath, reaching out to claim what it had been promised. The smothering nights. Nights grew unbearable. Without sound, time felt distorted, unmarked by the normal rhythm of owls, of crickets, of wind sighing through the trees. The village seemed suspended in a breathless void. Survivors woke often in the dark, drenched in sweat, claiming they felt something pressed against their chests. Like being watched, one woman wrote in a letter that she dared not send. Like silence itself has hands. On the 7th night, a family of 5 vanished. Their cottage door was left open, a candle burning low, but no trace of them remained, save for faint handprints carved deep into the wood of their dining table. A fading world. By the 2nd week, even those who had not been inside the church began to succumb. They reported strange lapses in memory. Meals half-eaten and forgotten. Hours missing without explanation. Farmers entered their barns and emerged pale, unable to recall why they had gone in. The silence had become more than absence. It was a contagion, spreading through thought, through memory, through life itself. One could almost imagine that Barrow Hollow itself was dissolving, stripped of its voice, being erased piece by piece. Yet amid all this terror, some clung to hope. A few whispered prayers in writing, passing notes beneath doors, believing that faith might shield them. But every morning, those notes were found blank, the words gone, the ink itself faded. As if silence had swallowed the very act of prayer. And so, the villagers of St. Barrow sat in their houses, lips pressed tight, waiting for a sound that would never come. The silence was no longer a visitor. It was home. It began with the sound they thought they would never hear again. For nights, Barrow Hollow had been gripped by a silence so thick that even the crack of wood, the cry of children, and the murmur of prayer had vanished into its maw. Yet on the 9th night, when the moon hung low and swollen above the crooked steeple of St. Barrow Church, the air shook with the toll of a bell. The bell that had been frozen since the night of the Mass. The sound rolled over the village like a wave of iron, deep and heavy. It struck exactly at 3 o'clock in the morning. Windows shuttered, dogs whimpered but without bark, and every survivor woke gasping as though pulled from drowning sleep. But the strangest thing was not that the bell rang. It was that no one touched it. The rope lay coiled at the bottom of the steeple, unmoved. The iron tongue within the bell swung of its own accord. And when the villagers gathered at dawn, they found one of their number gone. The first toll. The first to vanish was Elias Wilkes, the boy who had once traced spirals in ash before his mother's hearth. His bed was empty, his blanket folded back neatly, as if he had risen in obedience to some unheard command. Martha Wilkes, his mother, searched the house in panic. She scoured the fields, the streets, the edge of the woods, but Elias was gone. All that remained was a faint soot-marked spiral, drawn onto the wall beside his bed. Martha screamed, but even her screams sounded brittle, as if the silence was pulling them apart. Her neighbors held her trembling hands, but their own eyes betrayed the same terror. The toll of the bell had taken a child. The pattern. The next night it came again. 3 o'clock. The silence cracked open and the bell tolled once more, slow and measured, each strike echoing far longer than metal should allow. Villagers rose from their beds, clutching candles, staring toward the church steeple. The bell shook in the moonlight, its mouth gaping wide as though it were a voice of stone. By morning, Thomas Reed, the miller who had once scrawled, "It is not silence. It is listening," into his table, was missing. His house was found open, his table overturned, his chair splintered. Carved into the wood of the doorframe, as if by nails dragged slowly downward, was another spiral. The villagers began to whisper, "The bell is choosing." The gathering fear. By the third toll, no one dared sleep at night. Families huddled together, clutching each other in the dark, staring at the church tower as if watching for a beast to leap. They prayed, but their prayers were weak, collapsing into the silence that devoured them. When the bell rang again at the cursed hour, Agnes Hart's cottage was found abandoned. She had already been slipping, whispering of voices in her mind. Now she was gone completely. Only her rosary remained, each bead pressed deep into the wood of her floor, forming the same spiral the others had left behind. The spiral was no longer a symbol. It was a signature. The broken bell. On the fifth toll the villagers snapped. They stormed the church, a dozen of them carrying axes and hammers. By candlelight they climbed the steeple, their breath trembling as the bell loomed above them in the shadows. Its bronze sides were darkened, cracked through with lines like veins, as if the metal itself had been strained past endurance. "Break it," one man muttered, though his voice faltered in the stale air. They struck the bell with iron and wood, swinging until sparks flew. The bell shuddered under each blow, dust falling from the rafters, but it did not crack. Their hammers dented, their axes splintered, yet the bell remained. Worse, each strike made a faint ringing, a dull, hollow tone that did not echo but entered, as if the sound slid into their bones and clung there. One villager, Samuel Dyer, dropped his hammer and screamed that the bell was laughing. They dragged him down the steeple before he could leap from the window. They called it broken, not because they had shattered it, but because something inside it was no longer of this world. The sixth toll. The following night the toll returned. Not just once. 6 times the bell struck, each toll heavier, slower, vibrating the ground beneath their feet. The villagers knelt in their homes, clutching crosses, covering their ears, but the sound traveled through walls, through skin, through marrow. By morning 3 more were gone. A family this time, the Harts, husband, wife and child, taken from their cottage. Only 3 spirals were left burned into the plaster of their walls. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. Madness in the streets. The survivors staggered through the village as though drunk on dread. They began accusing one another, claiming some must be in league with the curse, calling others marked by it. Fists flew. Blood spilled silently into the dirt. Yet whenever they turned to the church, all anger drained away. The steeple towered like a sentinel, its bell waiting, heavy and hungry. The thought of the next toll bound them together in terror. Even those who had not been in the church that night began to fear the spiral marks. Some swore they could see faint impressions forming on their own doors, though no one dared touch them. Martha Wilkes's descent. Martha Wilkes, who had lost her boy to the first toll, began walking the streets at night, carrying a lantern with no flame. She stopped at each cottage, pressing her ear against the doors, listening. "Elias," she whispered, though her voice barely lived. "I hear you." When asked what she meant, she said she could hear his laughter in the ringing, beneath the iron weight of the bell. She claimed the silence was not empty but full, that her son was calling her, waiting inside the sound. By dawn Martha too was gone. Her lantern was found at the steps of the church, its glass cracked, its handle twisted into a spiral. The 7th night. The villagers knew now, every toll meant another soul claimed. The bell was a summons. A reminder of the vow Father Alistair had written of in his diary. And as the 7th night fell, they could not help but count the hours until 3. The moon rose. The wind stilled. The silence deepened. And then, with a shudder that shook the steeple, the bell began to swing. Not once. Not twice. 7 times. The earth itself seemed to moan. Windows shattered, the air thick with an iron taste, and across the village, screams rose, and died into nothing. When morning came, 7 homes stood empty. 7 new spirals marked the walls. And the church bell waited, its cracks spreading wider, as though it could break the world open if it wished. The silence was no longer creeping. It was conquering. The bell tolled one final time. It rang not at 3 nor at any hour men would name, but in the deepest hollow between night and dawn, when even the moon seemed to cower. Its cracked bronze swung of its own will, releasing a vibration that was not merely sound but a rending, a tearing of something unseen. Those who remained in Barrow Hollow woke as one, shivering in their beds. They did not need to ask what the toll meant. It was not summoning 1 or 2, not 7 or 8. This toll was for them all. The return of Father Alastair. Through the dark, a light appeared in the rectory. For weeks the priest had hidden himself away, his shutters nailed, his prayers devoured by the void. But now, as the bell howled, Father Alastair stepped into the street with a lantern. His face was pale, his hair unkempt, and his eyes were sunk deep into hollows of sleepless terror. The villagers stumbled from their houses, drawn to him like moths. They wanted answers, any words, before silence took them too. Children clung to mothers. Old men leaned upon staffs. Alastair raised a trembling hand. His voice, when it came, cracked like dry wood. Yet somehow it carried, though the silence gnawed at every syllable. "You must know the truth," he rasped. "4 lies cannot protect you any longer." The confession. He told them of the vow. When St. Barrow was founded, he said, the land was not empty. Beneath its soil, long before the stones of the church were laid, an altar had stood. It belonged to no God of light, no Christ of salvation, but to the silence, a thing worshipped in the black forests by forgotten tribes. They did not pray with words. They prayed by offering all sound, by feeding it their cries, their music, their very voices. When the church was built, its founders discovered the altar. But instead of destroying it, they bound themselves in covenant. The silence demanded a mass offering every century. A prayer spoken not to heaven, but to the absence beneath their feet. And that night, Alastair whispered, eyes glistening, was meant to be the centennial offering. A mass prayer, yes, but in truth, a mass sacrifice. The 30 who vanished did not vanish. They were taken, absorbed, consumed into the silence. Gasps escaped the crowd, though even those sounds seemed thin, frail. The villagers pressed closer, desperate for the priest to continue. "It does not hunger for death alone," he said. "It hungers for the end of all voice, all noise, all remembrance. It feeds on sound because sound is life. And now, it is not satisfied with 30. It wants the whole." The breaking of faith. A woman cried out, "Then stop it. You are our priest." But Father Alastair only shook his head. His hands trembled on the lantern's handle. "I tried. I sealed my lips, I prayed, I wrote in the diary, but I cannot banish what was buried in the foundation. Every word we speak is swallowed. Every prayer is devoured. I am no shepherd, only the witness of our ruin." The villagers began to shout, their voices breaking into chaos. Yet even in their frenzy their cries dissolved, fading into the oppressive quiet. The harder they screamed, the thinner their voices became, until mouths opened with nothing left to give. Above them the bell rang again. Its cracked bronze split wider. Shards of metal fell like teeth, clattering silently into the earth. The silence grew heavier. It was not absence now but presence, thick, smothering, alive. The consuming. The children were the first to falter. They staggered, clutching their throats as if voices were being torn from them. Mothers tried to hold them, but their arms slipped around children who were already fading, outlines thinning like smoke in wind. A boy reached for his father, lips forming words no one could hear. Then he collapsed into nothing, leaving behind only a faint spiral scorched into the dirt. Panic erupted. Men and women fled toward the woods, stumbling over each other, but even the sound of footsteps dulled. Some dropped mid-run, bodies folding into the earth without cry or trace. The silence was not chasing them. It was inside them. One by one they disappeared, leaving only spirals carved into walls, into doors, into ground. The priest alone. Father Alastair stood at the church steps, his lantern flickering. Tears streamed down his face. "I told you," he whispered, though his voice was already breaking apart, swallowed by the air. "I told you it would not end." His hands shook as he opened his diary once more, scrawling words with feverish speed. Ink blotted the page. The lantern guttered. "This is no absence. This is no void. The silence is a mouth, and we are the prayer upon its tongue." His writing faltered. The nib scratched spirals into the paper as his hand seized. He dropped the pen, clutching his throat. His lantern shattered at his feet, flames sputtering out without a hiss. And Father Alastair was gone. The diary remained, its pages fluttering in the windless night. The last survivor. By dawn, Barrow Hollow was empty. Doors swung open on silent hinges. Fires burned in hearts without crackle. Chickens pecked in silence, their masters gone. Every cottage bore spirals, some carved, some burned, some etched as if by invisible hands. The church steeple stood jagged, its bell split in two, fallen into the nave. Yet no sound lingered of its collapse. Only one voice remained to tell the tale. In the weeks that followed, a traveler passing through found the priest's diary and a bundle of loose papers, written in a shaking hand. They were confessions, final notes left by a man who had hidden in his cellar while the village dissolved. He wrote of how the silence seeped through the cracks, how he felt it pressing against his skull. He wrote of screams he could no longer hear, of shadows shaped like mouths in the corners of his vision. And in his final entry he wrote, "It is not gone. It has only learned. It wears us now. When you hear silence too deep to bear, know that it is not absence but presence. Know that it is listening. Know that your voice will join ours." The page ended there, stained with ink that had spiraled outward from the quill. The final silence. Barrow Hollow was never repopulate. Maps erased its name. Travelers spoke of an unease when passing through the valley, of birds refusing to sing, of wheels rolling over dirt that gave no sound. Some swore they could see shapes in the windows of the abandoned cottages, mouths moving soundlessly in the dark. Others claimed that if you stood before the ruined steeple at 3 o'clock in the morning, you would hear the bell ring. Not with sound but inside your bones. And if you stayed too long, you would find your words faltering, your thoughts unraveling into spirals, your voice fading until silence was all that remained. Because silence was not the absence of life. It was the life that came after.